On my 65th birthday, I stood hidden in my own pantry, listening to my 3 children plan my exile, but what they didn't know was that I'd been playing the confused old woman for months, and I was about to turn their game against them. The birthday cake sat untouched on my kitchen table, 65 flickering candles casting dancing shadows across 3 guilty faces. I wasn't supposed to hear their whispered conversation in the hallway, but when you've lived in the same house for 40 years, you know exactly which floorboards creak and how sound travels through these thin walls. Sunnydale Manor has an opening next month, my daughter Betty said, her voice barely audible through the door. Mom's getting worse, Edward. She left the stove on again yesterday. I pressed my back against the pantry door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Getting worse? I'd been sharper than ever lately, but I'd learned to play the part they expected, the confused, frail widow who couldn't manage on her own. You see, for the past 6 months, I'd been conducting my own little experiment. Every forgotten name, every trembling hand reaching for a coffee cup, every moment of manufactured confusion, it was all an act. I wanted to see what my children would do if they thought I was vulnerable. The results were about to break my heart. Brian's right about the house, Edward whispered back. We can't let her burn it down. Besides, the property's worth nearly $500,000 now. There it was. The truth I'd been dreading, but somehow always knew was coming. My late husband Harold had always said I was too trusting, too willing to see the best in people, even our own children. As I stood there in my floral birthday dress, listening to them discuss my future like I was already gone, I realized he'd been right about more than I'd ever imagined. The insurance alone would kill us if something happened, Betty continued. And honestly, she'd be safer with professional care. Professional care. Is that what we're calling it now? The conversation in the hallway ended, and footsteps approached. I quickly grabbed a box of crackers and stepped out of the pantry, putting on my best confused grandmother smile. They returned to the kitchen wearing bright, artificial smiles that made my stomach turn. Betty cut the cake with aggressive precision while Edward fumbled with his phone, and Brian, my youngest at 38, couldn't even meet my eyes. So, Mom, Betty began, her voice honey-sweet in that way that always meant trouble. We've been talking about your living situation. I let my hands tremble slightly as I reached for my coffee cup, a trick I'd perfected over the past 6 months. Oh? What about it, dear? We're worried about you being alone in this big house, Edward said, leaning forward with fake concern written all over his face. What if you fell? What if something happened and no one was here to help? What they didn't know was that I'd been deliberately leaving small signs of confusion around the house. An occasionally unwashed dish here, a light left on there, moments of manufactured forgetfulness during our phone calls. I'd wanted to see how they'd respond to my supposed vulnerability. The test results were devastating. We found a lovely place called Sunnydale Manor. Brian finally spoke up, his words tumbling out in a rush. It has activities, nurses on staff, people your own age to talk to. It sounds wonderful, I said softly, playing the grateful mother role I'd been perfecting. But I can't afford something like that. You know how tight things have been since your father passed. The 3 of them exchanged glances, quick, meaningful looks that told me everything I needed to know about their real motivations. Betty cleared her throat. Well, if we sold the house, there would be plenty to cover the costs. And, well, we'd help manage everything for you, of course. Help manage. Of course they would. The house has so many memories, I said, letting my voice waver with just the right amount of emotion. Your father and I raised you children here. We painted every room, planted every flower in the garden. Mom, Edward interrupted, his patience wearing thin. Those are just things. What matters is your safety and health. Just things. 40 years of building a life together, reduced to just things. What my children didn't know, what I'd been very careful to hide from them, was that while they assumed I was declining into helpless old age, I'd actually been busier than ever. Through a trusted foreman, I'd been quietly running Harold's construction business. I owned 3 rental properties they'd never heard of. I maintained investment accounts that would make their heads spin. The confused old woman act had been surprisingly useful for business. Contractors and tenants alike underestimated me, often revealing more than they intended during negotiations. Amazing how much people will say in front of someone they think isn't really listening. I need to think about it, I said, watching their faces fall slightly. It's such a big decision. Of course, Mom, Betty said, but I could hear the frustration creeping into her voice. Just don't think too long, okay? Good places like Sunnydale fill up fast. After they left that night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the remains of my birthday cake. 65 candles worth of wax had hardened into little pools on the frosting, kind of like how my heart felt in my chest. Over the next week, I made it my business to listen to more hushed conversations. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Whispered discussions during family dinners. Side conversations at my neighbor's funeral that they thought I couldn't hear. That's when I learned the real truth about my children's sudden concern for my welfare. Brian had gambling debts, serious ones. The kind that come with threats and deadlines. Edward's restaurant, the one he'd been so proud of, was hemorrhaging money and 3 months behind on rent. Betty's husband had lost his job 6 months ago, and they were facing foreclosure on their house. Suddenly, their concern for my safety made perfect sense. They weren't worried about me falling down the stairs. They were worried about their own financial freefall. My house, the Home Herald, and I had paid off years ago, wasn't just my sanctuary anymore. To my children, it had become their solution. $500,000 in equity, split 3 ways, would solve a lot of problems. All they had to do was convince one confused old woman that she couldn't take care of herself anymore. But here's what they didn't count on. I wasn't confused. I wasn't helpless. And I was about to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who's been watching and listening for months. The morning they planned to stage their intervention, I was ready for them. But first, I had some phone calls to make. They wanted to see a helpless old woman, so I gave them an Oscar-worthy performance, trembling hands, forgotten names, the whole act, while secretly documenting every lie they told me. The days following my birthday became a masterclass in deception. Every morning, I'd wake up and put on my costume, the slightly confused widow who needed help remembering which day it was. Every afternoon, I'd perform my role, the frail mother who struggled to open jars and forgot where she put her reading glasses. But every evening, when they thought I was sleeping, I was busy being someone else entirely, the sharp businesswoman who'd been helping Harold run his construction company for 20 years. Let me tell you something about pretending to be helpless. It's exhausting work, but it teaches you things about people you never wanted to know. Mom, did you remember to take your medication this morning? Betty would ask during her daily check-in calls, speaking slowly like I was a child. Oh dear, was I supposed to take something? I'd reply, letting confusion creep into my voice. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting at Harold's old desk, reviewing profit reports from our 3 rental properties. The performance was working too well. Every confused moment I acted out made them more confident in their plan. Every trembling hand reaching for a water glass convinced them they were doing the right thing. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd sit in Harold's home office, the room they rarely entered because Dad's old business stuff bored them, and I'd run numbers that would shock them senseless. Harold's construction company was thriving under my quiet management. Our foreman, Jake Martinez, had been Harold's right-hand man for 15 years, and he'd been mine for the 2 years since Harold passed. Together, we'd landed 3 major contracts this year alone. Mrs. Henderson, Jake had said during one of our weekly phone meetings, "You've got a sharper eye for these building estimates than your husband ever did. That new shopping center project? We're going to clear 6 figures easy." If only my children could hear those conversations. If only they knew that while they were whispering about my declining mental state, I was negotiating deals that would set me up for life. but they were too busy conducting their own investigation into my finances to notice what I was actually doing with my money. I started finding evidence of their snooping everywhere. Mail that had been opened and carefully resealed. Bank statements moved slightly from where I'd left them. My address book with certain pages dog-eared, probably copying down numbers for my financial advisor and attorney. The worst part? They were terrible at covering their tracks. "Mom," Edward said during one of his concerned son visits, "I was helping you organize your paperwork, and I noticed you haven't been balancing your checkbook regularly." "Oh, you know how I am with numbers, honey," I replied, shuffling papers around my kitchen table with deliberate confusion. "Your father always handled the money matters." What Edward didn't know was that I'd been balancing books since before he was born. What he also didn't know was that the checkbook he'd found was my grocery money account, the smallest of 7 accounts I maintained across 3 different banks. "Maybe it would help if one of us had power of attorney," he suggested, trying to sound casual. "You know, just to help with the complicated financial stuff." Power of attorney. There it was, the legal term that would give them complete control over my money while I was still breathing. "That sounds complicated," I said, playing up the confused act. "Let me think about it." But I wasn't thinking about it. I was planning for it. That same week, I had my attorney, Robert Chin, come to the house for what my children thought was a social visit. Robert had handled Harold's business affairs for years, but my children barely knew him. "Margaret," Robert said once we were alone in the kitchen, "I have to ask, are you really experiencing memory issues, or is something else going on here?" Smart man, Robert. Always was sharp about reading people. "Let's just say I'm conducting some research into my family's true motivations," I told him. "And I need to make sure my assets are protected while I do it." Over the next month, Robert helped me restructure everything. Trust funds, offshore accounts, business partnerships, all perfectly legal, all completely out of my children's reach, and all invisible to their amateur detective work. The irony was delicious. While they were photocopying my grocery receipts and calling my doctor's office pretending to be concerned about my episodes, I was moving millions of dollars around like chess pieces. But the performance had to continue. Every day brought new tests of my acting abilities. "Mom, you left the stove on again," Brian said during one visit, pointing to a burner I deliberately left on low heat under an empty pot. "Did I?" I gasped, putting my hand to my chest in mock horror. "Oh my goodness, what if there had been a fire?" Brian's eyes lit up like he'd won the lottery. Another piece of evidence for their case that I was a danger to myself. What he didn't see was me turning that burner on just 5 minutes before he arrived. What he also didn't see was the detailed notes I'd been keeping about each of their visits, documenting every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to gather evidence against me. The worst conversation I overheard happened on a Tuesday evening. I was supposed to be napping, but I'd positioned myself at the top of the stairs where I could hear everything happening in the living room below. "The realtor says we could get $550, maybe $600,000 in this market." Betty's voice drifted up to me. "Split 3 ways. That's $200 each," Edward calculated. "More than enough to cover the nursing home costs and still help with our situations." "What about Mom's other accounts?" Brian asked. "She's got to have more than just the checking account we saw." "Robert Chin would know," Betty replied. "But he's not going to tell us anything while she's still competent." Still competent. Those words hit me like a slap. They weren't just planning to take my house, they were planning to have me declared incompetent so they could access everything. "The important thing is getting her to agree to the nursing home first," Edward said. "Once she's there, we can handle the rest." Handle the rest. Like I was already dead. That night, I called Robert Chin at home. "Robert, I need you to arrange for a comprehensive mental competency evaluation," I told him. "I want official documentation that I'm of sound mind and body." "Margaret, what's going on?" "Let's just say my children are about to get the surprise of their lives, and I want to make sure all my legal bases are covered first." The competency evaluation took place 3 days later at Robert's office. 2 hours of cognitive tests, memory assessments, and psychological evaluations. I passed with what the doctor called exceptional scores for someone of any age. Armed with that documentation, I was ready for the next phase of my plan. But first, I had one more performance to give, the big one that would convince my children they'd finally won. You know what? I told Betty during her next visit, maybe you're right about that nursing home. Maybe it would be good to have people around, activities to do. The relief on her face was heartbreaking. She actually thought she was helping me. "Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you're being open to it," she said, hugging me tight. "We just want what's best for you." "No, you want what's best for your bank accounts," I thought, but I hugged her back and played the grateful mother. "When can we visit this Sunnydale place?" I asked, letting excitement creep into my voice. "I'll call them tomorrow," Betty promised. "We can go look at it this weekend." That weekend couldn't come fast enough. It was time for the final act of my performance, and then the real show could begin. While my children thought they were investigating my finances, I had someone investigating theirs, and what my private detective found would give me all the ammunition I needed for war. You want to know when I knew for certain that my children had crossed the line from concern into manipulation? It was the morning I found them in Harold's office, going through files they had no business touching. I was supposed to be at my doctor's appointment, an appointment Betty had insisted on scheduling for me because, Mom, you keep forgetting to make these calls yourself. But Dr. Phillips had to reschedule at the last minute, so I came home early. That's when I heard voices coming from the office Harold had always kept locked. "Did you find the insurance papers?" Edward's voice carried through the door. "Got them," Brian replied. "Life insurance pays out $250. Property insurance values the house at $520. "What about investment accounts?" Betty asked. "She has to have more than what shows up in that checking account." I stood in my own hallway, listening to my children inventory my life like vultures picking over roadkill. "There's a business account here with Harold's company name on it," Edward said. "Shows regular deposits, but I can't tell how much is in it." "That's because you don't know the first thing about how your father's business actually worked," I thought, gripping my purse handle so tight my knuckles went white. "We need to call that lawyer, Robert Chin," Betty said. "He'll have to tell us about Dad's estate eventually." "Only if Mom becomes incompetent," Brian pointed out. "Otherwise, he's bound by attorney-client privilege." Incompetent. There was that word again. I backed away from the door and left the house as quietly as I'd entered. I had phone calls to make, and I couldn't make them from a house where my own children were conducting surveillance. That afternoon, I met with Detective Maria Santos at a coffee shop across town. Maria came highly recommended by Robert Chin, 20 years with the police force before starting her own private investigation business. "Mrs. Henderson," Maria said, sliding a manila folder across the table, "are you sure you want to see what I found? Sometimes family secrets are secret for good reasons." "I need to know the truth about my children," I told her. All of it. What Maria had discovered over the past month made my stomach turn. Brian's gambling problem wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. He owed $47,000 to 3 different casinos, and the collection calls had escalated to threats. His wife Jennifer didn't even know about most of it because he'd been intercepting the mail and hiding statements. "He's been telling the debt collectors that he's about to inherit money," Maria explained, showing me photocopied documents. "He's used your name as a reference, telling them his mother is elderly and has significant assets. My youngest son was using my name to buy time with criminals." The thought made me sick. Edward's situation was even worse than I'd suspected. His restaurant wasn't just struggling, it was drowning in debt. He'd taken out 3 high-interest loans using his house as collateral, and he was 2 months away from losing everything. "The interesting part," Maria continued, "is what he told the loan officers. He claimed he had an elderly mother with property assets who would help guarantee the loans if needed. Another child using my name to secure money he had no right to expect. But Betty's betrayal cut the deepest. "Your daughter has been in contact with Sunnydale Manor for 3 months, Maria said, pulling out phone records. She's not just inquiring about availability, she's been discussing payment schedules and asking about their policies for residents with dementia. 3 months. Betty had been planning my exile since before my birthday, all while calling me every day to check on my well-being. There's more, Maria said gently. She's also been in touch with 2 different realtors, asking about market values for houses in your neighborhood. One of them gave her a written estimate. I stared at the documents spread across the coffee shop table, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest where my maternal love used to be. Mrs. Henderson, there's something else you need to know, Maria said, her voice dropping lower. Your children have been meeting regularly to coordinate their approach. They've been planning this together for months. She slid a final photograph across the table, a picture of my 3 children sitting at a restaurant booth, heads bent together over what looked like paperwork. This was taken 6 weeks ago, Maria explained. They've been meeting every Tuesday night at Romano's on 5th Street. Same table, same time. They call it their mom meetings. Mom meetings. Like I was a business problem they needed to solve. What kind of paperwork are they looking at? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. Based on the lip reading analysis and the documents visible in the photos, they appear to be reviewing your financial information, property values, and care facility options. My children had been conducting weekly strategy sessions about my future, and I wasn't invited to my own life planning meetings. There's one more thing, Maria said, hesitating. Yesterday, they scheduled an appointment with a lawyer who specializes in elder care and competency hearings. The appointment is set for next Friday. The coffee cup slipped from my hands, clattering against the saucer. They weren't just planning to put me in a nursing home, they were planning to take away my legal right to say no. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Based on what I observed, they plan to present you with the nursing home option this weekend. If you refuse, they'll likely move forward with legal action to have you declared incompetent. With your apparent memory issues and the evidence they've been collecting about leaving stoves on and forgetting appointments, they think they have a strong case. If only they knew how strong my case against them was becoming. That night, I sat in Harold's office, the same office where my children had been cataloging my assets like I was already dead, and I made a decision that would change our family forever. I called Maria Santos back. Maria, I need you to do something else for me, I said. I need you to document everything my children do over the next 2 weeks. Every meeting, every phone call, every conversation about me. I want it all recorded and documented. Mrs. Henderson, are you planning some kind of legal action? I'm planning to show my children exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who's been watching and listening for months. The next morning, Betty called with what she thought was wonderful news. Mom, I have great news. Sunnydale Manor has an opening, and they can fit us in for a tour this Saturday. Isn't that exciting? Oh, how wonderful, I replied, putting just the right amount of grateful confusion in my voice. Did we discuss this already? I'm sorry, dear, sometimes I forget what we've talked about. Don't worry about it, Mom. That's exactly why this is such a good idea. You won't have to worry about remembering anything once you're somewhere safe, with people to help you. Safe. What a funny way to describe a prison they were building around me. Should I pack anything special for the visit? I asked, playing the eager-to-please mother role. Just bring yourself, Betty said. We'll handle everything else. Yes, I thought as I hung up the phone. You certainly will handle everything. Just not the way you think you will. I thought I knew how desperate my children were, but when I followed the money trail, I discovered their betrayal went deeper than I ever imagined, and one of them had been stealing from me for years. The morning of my scheduled tour at Sunnydale Manor, I woke up with a sick feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with nerves. Maria Santos had called me the night before with information that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Mrs. Henderson, you need to sit down for this, Maria had said. I found something in your bank records that your children probably hoped you'd never discover. While my children had been busy playing detective with my grocery account and household bills, They'd missed the fact that I'd been monitoring every penny that flowed through my financial life. What I'd found would have made Harold reach for his shotgun. "Someone has been forging checks from your household account," Maria explained. "Small amounts, spread out over 18 months. $50 here, $100 there. Always just under the amount that would trigger automatic bank notifications." "How much total?" I'd asked, though my hands were already shaking. "Just over $4,000. "And Mrs. Henderson?" "The handwriting analysis shows it's your daughter Betty." "Betty, my firstborn. The child who used to bring me dandelions and tell me I was the most beautiful mommy in the world." Betty had been stealing from me for over a year while calling every day to check on my well-being. But that wasn't even the worst part of what Maria had discovered. "Your son Edward has been using your name and credit history to secure small business loans," Maria continued. "He listed you as a co-signer on 3 different loan applications without your knowledge or consent. That's identity theft, Mrs. Henderson. It's a federal crime. My middle child, the boy who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms, had committed fraud using my identity to save his failing restaurant." "And Brian?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Brian's been telling his creditors that he's your power of attorney. He's shown them forged documents indicating that he has legal control over your finances and can guarantee his gambling debts with your assets." All 3 of my children had been lying, stealing, and committing crimes using my name and my trust. The family I'd spent 65 years building had been demolished by greed, and I hadn't even known the wrecking ball was swinging. Now, sitting at my kitchen table on the morning of the nursing home visit, I looked around at the home Harold and I had built together and felt something I'd never experienced before: complete emotional detachment from the people who'd come out of my body. My phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. "Mom, we're on our way to pick you up," Betty's cheerful voice carried through the speaker. "Are you ready for your big adventure?" Adventure. Like I was a child going to the zoo instead of an adult being manipulated into giving up her freedom. "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it in ways she couldn't imagine. The drive to Sunnydale Manor was a masterclass in manipulation. My 3 children took turns pointing out things that proved I needed professional care. "Look at that lovely garden, Mom," Betty said from the front seat. "You won't have to worry about maintaining flower beds anymore. And see how wide those hallways are?" Edward added. "Perfect for wheelchairs and walkers when you need them." "The best part is the 24-hour nursing staff," Brian chimed in. "Someone will always be there if you fall or forget something important." They were talking about my future like I wasn't sitting right there listening to every word. Sunnydale Manor was exactly what you'd expect from a high-end nursing facility. Pretty wallpaper, hiding the smell of institutional disinfectant, activities designed to keep residents busy rather than engaged, and staff members who spoke to elderly people like they were particularly slow children. "Mrs. Henderson." The director, a woman named Sandra Mills, greeted me with a kind of enthusiastic smile usually reserved for toddlers. "We're so excited to show you around our little community." Little community. Prison with prettier curtains, more like it. As we toured the facility, I played my role perfectly. I admired the craft room where residents made potholders and painted ceramics. I nodded appreciatively at the dining room where meals were served at fixed times whether you were hungry or not. I smiled politely at the memory care unit, where people who'd forgotten their own names sat staring at television screens all day. But what my children didn't notice was how carefully I was listening to everything Sandra Mills wasn't saying. "Our memory care program is particularly comprehensive," Sandra explained as we walked past a locked unit. "Many families find it comforting to know their loved ones can transition seamlessly between levels of care as their needs change." Translation: once you're here for life, whether you're competent or not. "What's your policy on residents who want to leave?" I asked innocently. Sandra's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, that depends on their mental capacity assessment and family support, of course." Our medical team works closely with families to determine what's in each resident's best interest. Translation: if your family says you can't leave, you're not leaving. Mom doesn't need to worry about things like that, Betty interjected quickly. We just want her to focus on enjoying all the wonderful activities. After the tour, we sat in Sandra's office while she explained costs, care levels, and admission procedures. My children hung on every word like she was describing the path to salvation instead of the end of my independence. The monthly fee for Mrs. Henderson would be approximately $8,000, Sandra said, depending on her care level assessment. Most families find that selling the family home provides sufficient funds for several years of care. There it was. The connection between my house and my future imprisonment, laid out in black and white financial terms. That seems very reasonable, Edward said, glancing at his siblings. What do you think, Mom? All eyes turned to me, and I could feel the weight of their expectations, their desperation, their barely concealed greed pressing down on my shoulders. It's lovely, I said softly, letting my voice carry just a hint of confusion. But I'm worried about the cost. $8,000 a month. I don't have that kind of money. My children exchanged those quick glances again, the same looks they'd been sharing for months. Don't worry about the money, Mom, Betty said, reaching over to pat my hand. We'll figure all that out for you. We'll figure it out. With my house, my business, my investments they didn't even know existed. When would I need to decide? I asked. Well, Sandra said, consulting her calendar, we do have a waiting list, but given your situation, I think we could hold a spot for perhaps 2 weeks. 2 weeks to sign my life away. That would be wonderful, I said, smiling gratefully at my children. Thank you all for taking such good care of me. The drive home was celebratory. My children chatted excitedly about how perfect Sunnydale Manor would be, how much safer I'd be, how much happier I'd be with people my own age around all the time. They were planning my funeral, and they didn't even know I was still alive. That afternoon, after they'd left me alone with promises to handle all the paperwork, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first call was to Robert Chin. Robert, I need you to prepare documentation showing the full extent of my assets, I said. Everything. The construction business, the rental properties, the investment accounts, the offshore holdings. I want a complete financial picture. Margaret, what are you planning? Justice. The second call was to Maria Santos. Maria, I need you to prepare a comprehensive report on my children's financial crimes against me. Every forged check, every fraudulent loan application, every lie they've told using my name. I want it documented and ready for legal action. Are you pressing charges? I'm considering it. The third call was to Jake Martinez at the construction company. Jake, I need you to do something for me that might sound strange, I said. I need you to prepare a complete report on the company's financial status and my role in its management. I want documentation that shows I've been running this business actively for the past 2 years. Mrs. Henderson, is everything okay? Everything's about to be more okay than it's been in months. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by 40 years of memories and evidence of a life well lived. Tomorrow, my children would return with papers for me to sign, applications for Sunnydale Manor, and probably a realtor's listing agreement for the house. They thought they were closing in on the biggest score of their lives. Instead, they were about to walk into a trap that would teach them the difference between a confused old woman and a strategic mastermind who'd been planning their comeuppance for months. The war they'd started with whispered conversations and forged checks was about to become a battle they couldn't win. And I was going to enjoy every minute of watching their faces when they realized they'd been playing chess with someone who'd been 10 moves ahead of them all along. Tomorrow would be the most important day of our family's history. Too bad for them, I was the one writing the ending. When I overheard them discussing having me declared mentally incompetent, I knew they'd crossed a line, but what I did next would shock them more than they'd ever shocked me. 3 days after our visit to Sunnydale Manor, I was watering my kitchen herbs when I heard Betty's car pull into the driveway. But instead of coming to the door, she stayed in her car, talking on the phone with the window cracked open. I've always had excellent hearing, something my children seemed to forget when they wanted to have private conversations around me. No, she seemed to like the place, Betty was saying. But she's stalling on signing the paperwork. She keeps saying she needs more time to think about it. I moved closer to the window, my watering can still in hand. I know, Betty continued. But what if she just refuses? What if she digs in her heels and won't go? There was a pause while whoever she was talking to responded. Legal guardianship? Betty's voice got higher. Are you sure that's our only option? What would we have to prove? My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Mental incompetence, inability to make sound decisions about her own welfare. Betty was taking notes now. How long does that process usually take? I set the watering can down with shaking hands. They weren't just planning to convince me to go to Sunnydale Manor. They were researching how to legally force me there against my will. Tuesday at 2 o'clock, Betty said. Yes, I'll bring Edward and Brian. We need to understand all our options. After she hung up and came inside, Betty was all smiles and fake concern. Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today? Oh, fine, dear, I replied, though I felt anything but fine. Just tending to my little herb garden. That's nice, she said, but I could see her looking around the kitchen, probably searching for more evidence of my supposed decline. Mom, have you had a chance to think about what we discussed? About Sunnydale Manor. I'm still thinking, I said carefully. It's such a big decision. Betty's smile tightened around the edges. Mom, sometimes when we get older, big decisions become harder to make. Maybe it would help if we made this decision together as a family. Together as a family. What she meant was, let us decide for you because you're too confused to choose properly. That's very thoughtful, dear, I said. But I'm not quite ready yet. The look that flashed across Betty's face told me everything I needed to know about how much time I had left before they moved to Plan B. That evening, I called Robert Chin at home. Robert, I need to ask you a hypothetical question, I said. If someone wanted to have their elderly parent declared mentally incompetent, what would they need to prove? There was a long pause. Margaret, is this hypothetical question related to your current family situation? Let's say it might be. They'd need medical evidence of cognitive decline, documented incidents showing poor judgment or safety concerns, and testimony from family members about your inability to manage your own affairs. My stomach dropped. What if the person isn't actually incompetent? That's where it gets complicated. If someone is deliberately creating evidence of incompetence, leaving stoves on, appearing confused, forgetting important things, it could actually work against them in court. The appearance of decline can be just as damaging as actual decline. Perfect. My own acting had potentially given my children the ammunition they needed to destroy my legal rights. But, Robert continued, if that same person had recent documentation proving their mental competency, recent evidence of sound financial decision-making, and proof that they'd been managing complex affairs successfully, well, that would be a very different case. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course. The next morning, I did something my children would never expect. I scheduled myself for a comprehensive psychological evaluation at the best neuropsychological testing center in the city. Dr. Patricia Williams spent 4 hours putting me through every cognitive test imaginable. Memory assessments, problem-solving exercises, mental status examinations, the works. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Williams said when we finished, I have to ask, why did you request this evaluation? Your cognitive function is not just normal for your age, it's exceptional for any age. Let's just say I want documentation of my mental state at this point in my life, I told her. Well, you'll have plenty of that. Your scores place you in the top 5% of your age group across all categories. Your working memory, processing speed, and executive function are all superior. Superior. I liked the sound of that. But even as I was securing proof of my competency, my children were building their case for the opposite. That week, Edward started showing up at my house at random times, supposedly to check on me. But I noticed he always seemed to arrive right after I'd done something that could look concerning to an outside observer. "Mom, why is the front door unlocked?" he asked during one surprise visit. "Because I unlocked it 5 minutes ago when I saw your car coming down the street," I thought. Out loud, I said, "Oh dear, did I forget to lock it again?" Edward made a big show of testing the lock and shaking his head with concern. "Mom, this is exactly what we've been worried about. Anyone could just walk in here." "I know, honey. I'll try to remember." But I could see him making mental notes, building his catalog of evidence that his mother was becoming a danger to herself. Brian was doing the same thing, except his approach was more direct. "Mom, I think you should consider giving one of us power of attorney," he said during a visit that week. "Just as a precaution, you know? In case something happens and you need someone to make decisions for you." "What kind of decisions?" I asked, playing innocent. "Medical decisions, financial stuff, legal matters. It would just make things easier if there was ever an emergency." "Easier for whom?" I wondered. "I don't know, Brian. That sounds awfully complicated." "It's not complicated at all," he insisted. "I could take care of everything for you. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or bank accounts or any of that stressful stuff anymore. The stressful stuff like making sure my own money stayed in my own accounts instead of being gambled away by my youngest son." "Let me think about it," I said, using the phrase that was becoming my standard response to everything they suggested. But while they were busy building their case against my competency, I was quietly building a fortress around my assets that they couldn't even see, let alone breach. Working with Robert Chin, I moved money into protected trusts, transferred property into business entities they'd never heard of, and created legal structures that would survive any competency challenge they might bring. The best part? Every transaction required complex financial decisions and legal understanding, all documented proof that I was not only competent, but actively managing sophisticated affairs. "Margaret," Robert said during one of our planning sessions, "what you're doing here requires a level of financial acuity that most people half your age couldn't handle. If your children try to claim incompetency, this paper trail will destroy their case." "Good," I said, "because I have a feeling they're going to need destroying." That feeling proved correct sooner than I expected. The following Tuesday, the same day Betty had scheduled her appointment to learn about legal guardianship, I received a call that made my blood boil. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Sandra Mills from Sunnydale Manor. I wanted to follow up on your tour last week. Your daughter Betty called and asked us to hold your spot indefinitely because you're having some difficulty making decisions right now. She mentioned that your family might need to help you with the paperwork. They were already telling people I couldn't make my own decisions." "That's interesting," I said carefully. "What exactly did my daughter tell you?" "Well, she explained that you're experiencing some memory issues and confusion, and that the family is concerned about your ability to understand complex decisions. She asked about our policies for admissions when families need to override a resident's reluctance." Override my reluctance. Like I was a stubborn child refusing to eat my vegetables instead of a grown woman being manipulated into giving up my freedom. "I see," I said. "And what did you tell her about those policies?" We explained that with proper documentation of mental incapacity and family support, we can certainly work with families to ensure their loved ones get the care they need, even if they're initially resistant to the transition. Even if they're initially resistant. Translation: even if they're screaming no at the top of their lungs. That conversation was the final straw. My children weren't just planning to steal my money and my house, they were planning to steal my fundamental right to control my own life. But they'd made one crucial mistake in all their scheming. They'd underestimated exactly how sharp and strategic the woman they were trying to destroy actually was. It was time to show them what a truly competent woman could do when she was finally ready to stop playing defense and go on the attack. The trap was set. The evidence was gathered. The legal protections were in place. All I needed now was the perfect moment to spring it all on them, and I knew exactly how to create that moment. I gave them one last chance to choose love over money. The test was simple, but their failure was complete, and now I was ready to destroy the family they'd already betrayed. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. Before I unleashed everything I'd been planning, I was going to give my children one final opportunity to prove they still had hearts buried somewhere beneath their greed. The test I designed was cruel, but then again, so was what they'd been doing to me. I called Betty first, letting my voice sound weak and shaky in a way that wasn't entirely acting anymore. "Betty, honey, I need you to come over." I think something's wrong with me." "What do you mean, Mom? What kind of wrong?" "I woke up this morning and I couldn't remember yesterday at all. And I'm having chest pains." "I'm scared, Betty." The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long. Chest pains. Betty's voice took on a different quality, not exactly worried, more like calculating. "Mom, that sounds serious. Maybe we should call an ambulance." No hospitals," I said, playing the stubborn elderly woman perfectly. "I just need my family. Can you call your brothers? I need all of you here." "Of course, Mom. We'll be right there." But before she hung up, I heard her say something to someone in the background, call Robert Chen's office. If this is what I think it is, we need to move fast. My heart broke a little more. Even in what she thought was a medical emergency, Betty's first instinct was to call my lawyer, not my doctor. Within an hour, all three of my children were sitting in my living room, wearing expressions that looked more like anticipation than concern. I was sprawled on my couch, one hand pressed to my chest, the other covering my eyes like the light was bothering me. "How are you feeling now, Mom?" Edward asked, but his eyes were scanning the room instead of focusing on my face. Confused, I mumbled, "Everything feels foggy. I can't remember if I took my medication this morning. I can't remember what day it is." Brian leaned forward eagerly. "Mom, do you remember our conversation about Sunnydale Manor? A medical emergency, and he was asking about the nursing home. Not, are you in pain, or should we call your doctor? Just straight to the business that interested him." "Sunnydale? That's the place with the flowers?" I asked, deliberately mixing up details. My children exchanged those looks again, the same glances they'd been sharing for months, but now I could read them clearly. They weren't worried about my health. They were excited about my confusion. "Mom," Betty said, pulling out her phone, "I think we should call your doctor. But first, maybe we should also call Robert Chen. You know, just in case we need to make some decisions about your care. Just in case we need to make some decisions. Not just in case you need help. Just in case we need to take control." "I don't understand," I said, letting my voice sound small and frightened. "What decisions?" "Don't worry about it," Edward said, patting my arm absently. "We'll handle everything for you." While I lay there pretending to be in medical distress, my children spent the next 30 minutes discussing my future like I was already unconscious. They talked about expediting the Sunnydale Manor application. They discussed contacting my doctor about cognitive testing. They debated whether this episode was enough to justify immediate guardianship proceedings. Not once did anyone suggest calling an ambulance. Not once did anyone check my pulse or ask about my symptoms. Not once did anyone act like they were actually worried about my health rather than excited about my incapacity. The test was complete, and they had failed more spectacularly than I'd ever imagined possible. "You know what?" I said suddenly, sitting up straighter on the couch. "I think I'm feeling a little better now." "Are you sure, Mom?" Betty asked, but I could hear disappointment in her voice. "Maybe we should still call the doctor, just to be safe." "No, I think the spell is passing," I said, watching their faces carefully. Maybe I was just dehydrated. Or maybe I forgot to eat breakfast this morning. The deflation in the room was palpable. My medical emergency wasn't turning out to be the golden opportunity they'd hoped for. But they weren't giving up that easily. "Mom," Brian said, "even if you're feeling better now, this episode shows exactly what we've been worried about. What if this had happened when you were alone? What if you'd fallen or forgotten to call for help? We really think it's time to seriously consider Sunnydale Manor, Edward added. Today proved that you need professional care available 24 hours a day. Today proved that you need my money available 24 hours a day, I thought. You're probably right, I said softly, letting defeat creep into my voice. Maybe it is time. The relief in the room was disgusting. My children were practically glowing with satisfaction. Should we call Sandra Mills? Betty asked. Let her know you're ready to move forward? Maybe tomorrow, I said. I'm still feeling a little weak today. After they left that afternoon, with promises to check on me first thing in the morning, I sat alone in my living room and felt something inside me die completely. Any lingering hope I'd harbored that my children might actually care about my well-being was gone. They'd just spent an entire afternoon watching me have what they thought was a medical crisis, and their primary concern had been legal paperwork. That evening, I called Robert Chin one final time. Robert, I'm ready to proceed with everything we've discussed, I told him. Tomorrow morning, I want you to prepare 3 separate packages, one for each of my children. Include documentation of their financial crimes against me, evidence of their manipulation and lies, and my response to their behavior. What kind of response? The kind that will teach them the difference between a confused old woman and a strategic mastermind who's been planning their comeuppance for months. I spent that night going through 40 years of family photos, remembering birthday parties and Christmas mornings, first steps and graduation days. I remembered the children who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms and beg me for bedtime stories. Those children were gone, replaced by adults who saw me as nothing more than a financial obstacle to overcome. By sunrise, I was ready to show them exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness and love for stupidity. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time in months, I was looking forward to something. My children thought they were closing in on the biggest score of their lives. Instead, they were about to learn that the woman they'd been plotting against was 10 steps ahead of them and twice as ruthless as they'd ever imagined. The war they'd started with whispered conversations and forged checks was about to end with a nuclear strike they never saw coming. And I was going to enjoy every single second of watching their faces when they realized they'd been playing chess with a grandmaster who'd been anticipating their every move since the very first day they decided to treat their mother like prey. Tomorrow would be the most important day in our family's history. Too bad for them, I was the one holding all the cards. They walked into my living room expecting to manipulate a confused old woman into signing her life away. Instead, they got the surprise of their lives when I revealed I'd been 10 steps ahead of them all along. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more focused. Perfect weather for the day I was about to destroy my children's world. I'd been up since 5 o'clock, making final preparations. The manila envelopes sat on Harold's old desk, each one thick with documentation that would change everything. The recording device Maria Santos had given me was tucked discreetly behind a picture frame, ready to capture every word of what was about to happen. At exactly 10 o'clock, Betty's car pulled into my driveway, followed closely by Edward's truck and Brian's sedan. They were arriving together. Always a bad sign, and they were carrying briefcases and folders. Today was the day they planned to close the deal on my freedom. I positioned myself in my favorite armchair, the one Harold used to sit in when he wanted to have serious conversations with the children about grades or behavior. It felt appropriate. They knocked on the door like visiting business people rather than family members, which I suppose was exactly what they were. "Good morning, Mom," Betty said, leading the procession into my living room. "How are you feeling after yesterday's episode?" "Much better, thank you," I replied, noting how they all chose seats that faced me, like they were conducting an intervention. "Mom, we've been talking," Edward began, opening his briefcase with the confidence of a man who thought he was in control of the situation. "After what happened yesterday, we think it's time to make some important decisions about your future. We've brought all the paperwork for Sunnydale Manor, Brian added, pulling out a stack of documents. We can get everything signed today and have you moved in by next week. Next week. They weren't wasting any time. We've also prepared some other documents, Betty said, sliding a folder across the coffee table toward me. Power of attorney papers, so we can help manage your finances and medical decisions. It'll take all the stress off your shoulders. Take all the control out of my hands, more like it. I looked at the 3 folders they'd placed in front of me like offerings to a deity they were trying to appease. Inside those folders was everything they needed to legally steal my life. This is so thoughtful of you, I said softly, letting my voice carry the same confused gratitude I'd been perfecting for months. But I have to ask you something first. Of course, Mom, Betty said, leaning forward with fake concern. What is it? I stood up slowly, walked to Harold's desk, and picked up the 3 manila envelopes I'd prepared. When I turned back around, I was no longer the confused old woman they expected to see. I need to know, I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you going through my mail? Checking my bank statements? Having those little strategy meetings every Tuesday night at Romano's restaurant? The change in the room was immediate. 3 faces went from confident manipulation mode to deer-in-headlights shock in less than a second. Mom, what are you talking about? Betty stammered, but the color was draining from her face. I'm talking about the fact that I've been aware of your little scheme for months now, I continued, feeling stronger and more clear-headed than I had since this whole nightmare began. Did you really think I wouldn't notice Betty forging checks from my household account? Or Edward using my name on loan applications without my permission? Or Brian telling his gambling creditors that he's my power of attorney? The silence in the room was deafening. Edward's mouth fell open. Brian looked like he might throw up. Betty's hands were shaking. Mom, we never meant, Edward started to say. Yes, you did, I interrupted, my voice cutting through his excuse like a blade. You meant every single word of it. You've been planning this for months, meeting every week to coordinate your approach, researching legal ways to have me declared incompetent if I refuse to cooperate. How do you? Betty began, then stopped herself. How do I know? Because unlike what you assumed, I'm not losing my mind. I'm not helpless. And I'm certainly not stupid. I walked closer to where they sat, enjoying the way they shrank back slightly. I hired a private detective 6 months ago. I have documentation of every lie you've told, every crime you've committed using my name, every manipulation you've attempted. Brian found his voice first. Mom, you don't understand. We were just trying to help. Help. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Brian, you told casino debt collectors that you could guarantee your $47,000 in gambling debts with my assets. That's not help, that's fraud. His face went white. How do you know about that? Edward, you forged my signature on 3 separate loan applications, using my credit history to secure money for your failing restaurant. That's identity theft, and it's a federal crime. Edward's briefcase slipped from his hands, papers scattering across my carpet. And Betty, I continued, turning to my eldest daughter, you've been stealing from me for 18 months. Small amounts, spread out over time, hoping I wouldn't notice. $4,063, to be exact. Betty started crying, but I felt no sympathy for her tears. The saddest part, I said, walking back to my desk and picking up the recording device, is that I kept hoping you'd prove me wrong. Even yesterday, when I pretended to have a medical emergency, I thought maybe, just maybe, one of you would actually be concerned about my health instead of excited about the opportunity to take control of my affairs. You were pretending? Edward whispered. I've been pretending to be confused and helpless for months, I told him. It was a test. I wanted to see what you would do if you thought I was vulnerable and needed your protection. I pressed play on the recording device. Their own voices filled the room from yesterday's conversation. This episode shows exactly what we've been worried about. We really think it's time to seriously consider Sunnydale Manor. Today proved that you need professional care available 24 hours a day. Should we call Sandra Mills? Let her know you're ready to move forward. The sound of their own voices, so excited about my supposed decline, hung in the air like poison. While you were discussing nursing homes, I continued, not one of you suggested calling a doctor. Not one of you checked to see if I was actually in medical distress. Your first instinct was to call my lawyer about legal guardianship. The room was silent except for Betty's quiet sobbing. Here's what's actually going to happen, I said, my voice steady as steel. I've spent the last 6 months documenting everything you've done, protecting my assets from your schemes, and preparing for this exact moment. I held up the 3 manila envelopes. These contain my response to your betrayal. Each of you gets one. Open them. With shaking hands, they opened the envelopes I'd prepared. I watched their faces as they read the contents, saw the exact moment each of them realized how completely they'd underestimated their mother. Brian, I said, I'm paying off your gambling debts directly to the casinos. Not through you. I wouldn't trust you with a dollar bill at this point. Consider it your inheritance, because you won't be getting another penny from me. Brian's face crumpled. Mom, please. Edward, your restaurant is being bought out by a management company I hired. You can work there as an employee, or you can find another job. Either way, you'll never again be in a position to forge my name on loan documents. Edward stared at the papers in his hands like they were written in a foreign language. And Betty, I said, turning to my daughter, your mortgage is being paid through a trust fund that will cover exactly 10 years of payments. After that, you're on your own. The theft charges I could press against you are detailed in that folder, along with my decision not to pursue them, this time. Betty looked up at me through her tears. Mom, we never meant for it to go this far. We were scared. Scared? I laughed bitterly. You want to know what scared looks like? Scared is a 65-year-old woman standing in her own pantry, listening to her children plan to steal her house and lock her away in a nursing home. Scared is realizing that the people you love most in the world see you as nothing more than a financial obstacle to overcome. The fight went out of all 3 of them simultaneously. They sat in my living room like deflated balloons, surrounded by the wreckage of their failed scheme. As for me, I said, walking to the window and looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together, I'm not going to any nursing home. I'm selling this house, but the money isn't going to solve your problems. It's going with me to the cabin in Montana that you forgot your father left me. Montana, Betty whispered. I'll be perfectly fine on my own, I continued. Turns out, I'm a lot more capable than any of you realized. While you were planning to steal my assets, I was actively managing a construction business, 3 rental properties, and investment accounts you never even knew existed. The look of shock on their faces would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. You thought you were manipulating a helpless old woman, I said, turning back to face them. Instead, you were trying to con someone who's been running circles around you for months. I walked to the front door and opened it. You have 24 hours to decide whether you want my help under my conditions or nothing at all, I told them. Choose wisely, because this is the last chance you'll get to prove you can choose family over greed. One by one, they walked past me and out of my house, carrying their folders of consequences and shattered dreams of easy money. As I watched their cars drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete and utter peace. The war they'd started with whispered conversations and forged checks was finally over. And I had one. I thought cutting them off completely would hurt too much, but what I did instead was far more devastating. I gave them exactly what they thought they wanted, but on my terms, and it destroyed them. The 24 hours I'd given my children stretched out like the longest day of my life. I spent the time packing up 40 years of memories, deciding what was worth taking to Montana and what belonged to a life I was leaving behind. Harold's fishing tackle went into the keep pile. The china set we'd received as a wedding gift that I'd never really liked went into the donate box. Photo albums filled with pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings when my children still looked at me with love instead of dollar signs. Those were the hardest to sort. At exactly 10 o'clock the next morning, my phone rang. Mom? It was Betty, and she sounded like she'd been crying all night. Can we come over? We need to talk. Of course, I said, though my heart was steel-wrapped and ready for battle. But this is your last chance to show me who you really are. 20 minutes later, they were back in my living room, but this time they looked like completely different people. Gone was the confident manipulation from yesterday. Today they looked broken, ashamed, and desperate in ways that had nothing to do with money. Mom, Edward began, his voice hoarse, we know what we did was wrong. We know we hurt you in ways that can't be undone. We were scared, Brian added quickly. My gambling debts, Edward's restaurant, my mortgage. We were drowning and we thought you were our only way out. So you decided to convince me I was incompetent instead of simply asking for help? I asked, my voice calm but cutting. We knew you'd help us if we asked, Betty whispered. But we also knew it would mean giving up the house, depleting your savings, risking your security. We thought if we could make you believe you needed care anyway, you could steal everything I had while convincing yourselves you were doing it for my own good. I finished for her. The silence that followed was deafening. Here's what I don't understand, I continued, looking at each of them in turn. You knew I would help you if you asked honestly. You knew I loved you enough to sacrifice my own comfort for your well-being. But instead of trusting in that love, you chose manipulation and theft. Because we're cowards, Edward said suddenly. We're cowards who couldn't face disappointing you with our failures. So instead you decided to betray me completely? We know how it sounds, Betty said through her tears. We know how horrible we've been. But we never wanted to hurt you. We panicked. I stood up and walked to Harold's desk, where I'd prepared one final set of documents. Here's the thing about panic, I said, pulling out a thick folder. When people panic, they reveal who they really are underneath all the social niceties and family obligations. And what you revealed to me over these past months is that when your backs are against the wall, you see your mother as prey. I handed the folder to Betty. This contains documentation of every crime you've committed against me. Forgery, identity theft, fraud, theft by deception. It also contains my decision about whether to press charges. Betty's hands shook as she opened the folder. Her face went white as she read. I'm not pressing charges, I continued, but not because I forgive you. I'm not pressing charges because I want you to live with what you've done. I want you to rebuild your lives knowing that you destroyed your relationship with your mother for money you never even got. Mom, please, Brian started. I'm not finished, I cut him off. You want to know what your betrayal cost you? It wasn't just the money you thought you'd get from selling my house. It wasn't just the inheritance you've lost. I walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd raised them, where they'd learned to ride bikes and caught fireflies and believed their mother would always be there to protect them. What you lost was my trust, my respect, my willingness to see you as the children I raised instead of the adults you became. I turned back to face them. I will pay off Brian's gambling debts, but the money goes directly to the casinos. I will buy out Edward's restaurant, but it will be managed by professionals. I will pay Betty's mortgage, but only for 10 years. Why? Betty asked through her tears. Why help us at all after what we did? Because, I said, my voice softening slightly for the first time, somewhere underneath the adults who betrayed me are the children I used to love. And those children deserve a chance to rebuild their lives and become better people than they are right now. The room fell silent again. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Peterson from next door talking to her cat, the same routine she'd followed every morning for the 15 years I'd lived here. There are conditions, I continued. Strict ones. Edward looked up. What kind of conditions? First, you will all enter counseling. Individual therapy to figure out how you became people who could steal from their own mother. Family therapy if you want any chance of rebuilding our relationship. They nodded eagerly, desperately. Second, you will have no access to any of my other assets. Ever. What I'm giving you now is everything you'll ever get from me financially. We understand, Brian said quickly. Third, I'm moving to Montana next month. You can visit if you want, but only if you've proven through your actions, not your words, that you're committed to becoming better people. How do we prove that? Betty asked. By building lives that don't depend on stealing from other people, I said bluntly. By taking responsibility for your own problems instead of looking for someone else to solve them. By showing me that you can choose integrity over convenience. I walked to my desk one more time and pulled out 3 envelopes, smaller ones this time. These contain the contact information for the therapists I've already arranged for each of you. Your first appointments are scheduled for next week. The fees are paid for 1 year. They took the envelopes like they were lifelines. Mom, Betty said softly, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive us? Really forgive us? I looked at my 3 children. My daughter who'd been stealing from me for over a year, my son who'd been gambling away his family's future, my other son who'd committed identity theft rather than admit his business was failing. I don't know, I said honestly. Forgiveness isn't something you get just because you want it. It's something you earn through consistent actions over time. Right now, I can't even trust you enough to be in the same room without documenting our conversations. As if to prove my point, I reached over and turned off the recording device that had been running this entire time. You're recording us? Edward asked. I've been recording every conversation we've had since I found out about your scheme, I told him. When you can't trust your own children, you have to protect yourself however you can. The hurt on their faces at that revelation was almost satisfying. Here's what's going to happen, I said, walking them toward the door. You're going to take the help I'm giving you and use it to build better lives. You're going to go to therapy and figure out how you became people who could do what you did. And maybe, if you work hard enough and prove consistently that you've changed, we might be able to have some kind of relationship again. What kind of relationship? Betty asked. I don't know yet, I admitted. But it will never be the same as it was. The mother who would have given you anything out of love had to learn to protect herself from the adults you became. They filed out of my house looking like they'd been hit by a truck. Which, in a way, they had. As I watched their cars drive away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief mixed with profound sadness. Relief that the war was over, that I'd won, that I was finally free from their manipulation and lies. But also sadness for the family we used to be, for the children who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, for the dreams I'd had of growing old surrounded by people who loved me rather than people who saw me as a financial opportunity. That evening, I called the moving company and scheduled them to pack up my life in 2 weeks. Montana was waiting for me, clean air, mountain views, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you fought for your dignity and won. My children had wanted to inherit my house, my money, my entire life's work. Instead, they'd inherited the consequences of their own choices and the long, difficult road back to becoming people worthy of love and trust. Whether they took that road or not was up to them. But either way, I was finally free. 18 months in the mountains taught me something I never expected. Sometimes you have to lose your family to save yourself, and sometimes that's the only way to find them again. The Cabin Herald left me sat on 47 acres of Montana wilderness, 3 hours from the nearest town and a lifetime away from the suburban neighborhood where I'd raised my children. When I first drove up that winding mountain road with my belongings packed into a U-Haul trailer, I thought I was running away from everything I'd ever known. Turns out, I was running toward the person I'd forgotten I could be. The first few months were brutally lonely. I'd wake up in a house where no one was scheming behind my back, where the mail stayed exactly where I left it, where my bank statements remained unopened by anyone but me, and sometimes the silence felt worse than the betrayal. Harold's cabin was bigger than I'd remembered from our anniversary trips. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a stone fireplace that dominated the living room, and windows that looked out on mountains that stretched to the horizon like God's own promise of endless possibilities. But it was quiet. So quiet that sometimes I'd turn on the radio just to hear human voices that weren't trying to manipulate me into giving up my independence. The first letter from my children arrived 6 weeks after I moved. It was from Betty, handwritten on the floral stationery I'd given her for her birthday years ago. Her therapist had suggested she write to me, she said. She wanted me to know she was going to meetings, working on her problems, trying to understand how she'd become someone who could steal from her own mother. I read the letter 3 times, then put it in a shoebox with Harold's old fishing licenses. I wasn't ready to respond, but I wasn't ready to throw it away either. More letters followed. Edward wrote about selling his house to pay back some of the money he'd stolen through forged loan applications. Brian sent updates from Gamblers Anonymous, where he was learning to face his addiction instead of trying to solve it by stealing from family members. They were trying, I'd give them that. But trying to fix what they'd broken and actually fixing it were 2 different things. The loneliness got easier as I settled into routines, Harold, and I had never had time for when we were younger. I read books without interruption. I learned to identify birds by their songs. I started a vegetable garden that nobody could judge or criticize or secretly plan to inherit. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own judgment again. For months, my children had been gaslighting me, making me question my own competence, my own perceptions, my own right to make decisions about my own life. Living alone in Harold's cabin with nothing but my own thoughts and choices, I remembered what it felt like to trust myself completely. I also discovered that the woman they'd been trying to convince was helpless was actually more capable than she'd ever been. Jake Martinez called me every week with updates about the construction business. We'd landed 2 major contracts since I moved to Montana, and profits were up 30% over the previous year. Mrs. Henderson, Jake said during one of our calls, I have to tell you, some of these contractors are still asking about when your son-in-law is going to start handling things. They can't seem to wrap their heads around the fact that you're the one making the real decisions. Let them wonder, I told him. As long as the work gets done and the checks clear, they can think whatever they want. The rental properties were thriving too. My tenants appreciated having a landlord who responded quickly to problems and didn't try to nickel and dime them over repairs. Amazing how much easier property management became when I didn't have to worry about children going through my files and second-guessing every decision. By the end of my first year in Montana, I was healthier, happier, and more financially secure than I'd been since Harold died. The stress of constantly being on guard against my own family had been eating me alive, and I hadn't even realized it until it was gone. But the loneliness remained. I missed having family dinners, even the tense ones from recent years. I missed birthday phone calls and holiday traditions. I missed the people my children used to be before money corrupted their love into something ugly and grasping. Their letters kept coming, and gradually they began to change in tone. Betty's letters shifted from apologies to updates about her life. She'd found a new job as a bookkeeper. Ironic, I know, Mom, that I'm now trusted with other people's money when I couldn't be trusted with yours. She was learning to manage her finances properly, attending therapy religiously, and slowly rebuilding her marriage. Edward's updates focused on his work as a line cook in someone else's restaurant. The business I'd bought out was profitable under professional management, but Edward had chosen to work elsewhere rather than stay in a place that reminded him daily of his failures. I need to learn to earn success instead of inheriting it, he'd written. Brian's letters were the most surprising. Gamblers Anonymous had led him to volunteer work with financial literacy programs for people struggling with debt. Turns out, he wrote, helping other people avoid the mistakes I made helps me avoid making them again. I read every letter, but didn't respond to any of them. I wasn't ready for conversation yet, wasn't ready to risk letting my guard down only to discover they were still manipulating me. Then, 18 months after the confrontation that had ended our old family dynamic, I looked out my kitchen window and saw a familiar car coming up the mountain road. Betty's blue sedan moved slowly along the winding dirt path, like she wasn't sure she had the right to be there. Which, honestly, she didn't. I watched through the window as she parked next to my truck and sat in her car for several minutes, probably gathering courage or rehearsing what she planned to say. When she finally got out, I could see how much she'd changed. She looked older, more tired, but also more solid somehow. Like she'd stopped floating through life and planted her feet firmly on the ground. She knocked on the door like a stranger, which I suppose she was now. "Hi, Mom," she said when I opened it. I know I should have called first, but I was afraid you'd tell me not to come. "You were right about that," I said, but I stepped aside to let her in. Betty looked around Harold's cabin like she was seeing it for the first time, which she essentially was. During our anniversary trips years ago, the children had always stayed home. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Dad would have loved seeing you settled in this place." "Your father would have been heartbroken by what you children did to me," I replied, not ready to exchange pleasantries about Harold's memory. Betty's face crumpled slightly, but she didn't argue. "You're right. He would have been ashamed of us." We stood in the living room for several uncomfortable minutes, two women who used to share everything now struggling to find common ground. "Why are you here, Betty?" I finally asked. "Because it's been 18 months and I miss my mother," she said simply. "Because I've done everything you asked me to do, therapy, financial responsibility, rebuilding my life, and I need to know if any of it matters to you." I looked at my eldest daughter, the child who used to bring me dandelions and construction paper cards that said, "Best mommy ever." The woman standing in my living room looked like her, but I wasn't sure who she really was anymore. "Sit down," I said finally. "We need to talk." As Betty settled onto Harold's old couch, I realized that this conversation would determine whether our family had any future at all, or whether the damage my children had done was too deep to ever heal. Either way, it was time to find out what 18 months of consequences had actually taught the daughter who'd once stolen from me while telling me she loved me. The mountains outside my windows had seen a lot of storms over the centuries. They were about to witness one more. Sitting on my porch watching the sunset with my daughter, she asked if I could ever forgive them. My answer changed our relationship forever, and it might change how you think about family too. Betty and I spent the first hour of her visit dancing around the real conversation we needed to have. We talked about the weather in Montana versus back home. We discussed the changes in the old neighborhood. We covered everything except the 18 months of silence between us and the betrayal that had caused it. Finally, as the afternoon sun began its slide behind the mountains, I made us both coffee and suggested we sit on the porch. "Mom," Betty said as we settled into Harold's old Adirondack chairs, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "I've been honest with you about everything that mattered," I said. "The question is whether you've been honest with me. That's what I need to ask you about." Betty stared out at the mountain vista, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like it was an anchor. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive us? Really forgive us? Or am I just wasting my time trying to rebuild something that's broken forever?" I'd been dreading this question for 18 months, but I'd also been thinking about it every single day. "Tell me what forgiveness means to you," I said. What do you mean? Do you think forgiveness means pretending what happened never occurred? Do you think it means going back to the way things were before? Do you think it means I should trust you the same way I used to?" Betty was quiet for a long moment. "I used to think that's what it meant," she said finally. "But 18 months of therapy has taught me that's not realistic." "What has therapy taught you?" "That forgiveness is about letting go of anger, not about forgetting consequences." Betty looked at me directly for the first time since she'd arrived. "That I can't earn your trust back just by wanting it. That some relationships can heal, but they're never the same as they were before." I felt something inside my chest loosen slightly. "What else has therapy taught you?" "That what we did to you wasn't desperation. It was entitled selfishness dressed up as concern." Betty's voice got quieter. "We convinced ourselves we were helping you, but really we were just helping ourselves to your money and your autonomy." "Keep going." "That we didn't just steal your money, Mom. We stole your sense of safety in your own family. We made you question your own competence. We treated you like an obstacle instead of a person." The tears came then, and this time they felt real instead of manipulative. "And that's the part one can never fix," Betty continued through her sobs. "I can pay back every penny I stole. I can go to therapy for the rest of my life. I can prove I'm financially responsible and emotionally stable and everything else you need me to be. But I can never give you back the feeling of being loved and protected by your own children. I set my coffee mug down and looked out at the mountains Harold had loved so much. Somewhere up there, an eagle circled in the late afternoon thermals, hunting for prey with the kind of focused patience I'd had to learn over the past 18 months. You're right about that, I said finally. You can't give that back to me. Betty's shoulders shook with silent sobs. But, I continued, you can give me something else. She looked up at me with red, hopeful eyes. You can give me adult children who choose integrity over convenience. You can give me a relationship based on mutual respect instead of assumed obligation. You can give me the peace of mind that comes from knowing my children have learned to solve their own problems instead of looking for someone else to exploit. Have I done that? Betty asked. Have any of us done that? I thought about the letters I'd been receiving, the updates from their therapists that I'd required as part of their assistance packages, the reports from the private detective I'd kept on retainer to monitor their progress. Brian has been debt-free for 8 months, I said. He volunteers 15 hours a week helping other people understand financial responsibility. His marriage is stronger, and his wife Jennifer finally knows the truth about everything that happened. Betty nodded. He calls me every week. He's different now. More honest about his struggles. Edward paid back every penny he stole through forged loan applications, I continued. He's working as a line cook making $12 an hour, and he's never been prouder of a job in his life. The restaurant I bought out is thriving under professional management, and he's earned the right to buy it back if he wants to. And me? Betty asked quietly. You've been fully employed for 14 months. Your mortgage payments come out of your own bank account now instead of the trust fund I set up. You've attended therapy every week without fail. And according to my sources, you haven't opened anyone else's mail or gone through anyone else's financial documents since the day I confronted you. You've been having us watched? Betty asked, but she didn't sound angry, just resigned. Trust but verify, I said. Although in your case, it was verify first, then maybe trust later. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the mountains change color as the sun moved lower in the sky. So, what does this mean for us? Betty finally asked. Can we have a relationship? Can I have my mother back? You can have a relationship with me, I said carefully. But I'll never be the same mother I was before. That woman was naive enough to trust completely without requiring proof. That woman would have given you anything out of love without protecting herself first. What kind of mother are you now? I smiled for the first time since Betty had arrived. I'm the kind of mother who loves her children but isn't controlled by that love. I'm the kind of mother who will help you when you need it but won't enable you when you're being destructive. I'm the kind of mother who has learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their own choices. That sounds lonely, Betty said. It's less lonely than being surrounded by people who pretend to love you while plotting to steal from you, I replied. Betty flinched, but she didn't argue. Here's what I can offer you, I said, turning to face her fully. I can offer you a relationship where love comes with boundaries, where trust is earned through consistent actions over time, where help is available when you truly need it, but manipulation is met with immediate consequences. What kind of boundaries? No access to my financial information beyond what I choose to share. No visits to my home without invitation. No involvement in my business or medical decisions unless I specifically ask for your input. Betty nodded slowly. That sounds fair. Most importantly, I continued, no more family meetings about mom behind mom's back. If you have concerns about my well-being, you discuss them with me directly. If you need help, you ask for it honestly instead of trying to manipulate me into offering it. And if we violate those boundaries, then the relationship ends, I said simply. No second chances, no negotiations, no family drama. Clean break, permanent consequences. The sun was setting now, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and pink that took my breath away even after 18 months of mountain sunsets. Mom, Betty said softly, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know what we did was unforgivable. But I need you to know that losing you was the worst consequence of all. Worse than the therapy, worse than the financial struggle, worse than the shame of knowing what we'd done. Good, I said, and I meant it. That tells me you might actually have learned something from all this. Does that mean you forgive us? I thought about Harold, who'd always been better at forgiveness than I was. I thought about the children they used to be, before money and desperation corrupted their love into something unrecognizable. I thought about the adults they were becoming, slowly and painfully, through the consequences of their own choices. I forgive you for being human and making terrible mistakes, I said finally. I forgive you for being scared and handling that fear in the worst possible way. I forgive you for the lies and the manipulation and the months of making me question my own sanity. Betty started crying again, but I held up a hand. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending it never happened. It doesn't mean going back to the way things were before. What does it mean? It means I'm choosing not to let your worst actions define our relationship forever. It means I'm willing to build something new with the people you're becoming instead of staying trapped by the people you were. I reached over and touched Betty's hand, the first physical contact we'd had in 18 months. It means I love you enough to maintain boundaries that protect both of us from your destructive impulses and my enabling tendencies. Betty squeezed my hand tight. Can I tell Edward and Brian what you said? You can tell them that the door is open if they want to walk through it, I said. But they have to walk through it as the people they are now, not the people they used to be. And they have to accept that the relationship on the other side of that door is different from what we had before. Different how? Smaller, maybe. More careful. But also more honest. I smiled at my daughter, feeling lighter than I had in months. And possibly stronger, because it's built on choice instead of obligation, respect instead of assumption, earned trust instead of blind faith. Betty stayed for dinner, and we talked about ordinary things. Her job, her marriage, the books I'd been reading, the garden I was planning for spring. It felt strange but good, like trying on clothes that almost fit but would need alterations to work properly. As she prepared to drive back down the mountain that evening, Betty hugged me goodbye, carefully, like she wasn't sure she had the right to do it. Mom, she said, thank you for not giving up on us completely. Thank you for becoming people worth not giving up on, I replied. After her car disappeared around the first bend in the mountain road, I sat on my porch in the growing darkness and felt something I hadn't experienced since before Harold died, hope for my family's future. Not the future I'd originally planned, where my children took care of me in my old age out of love and gratitude. Not the future they'd planned, where they inherited my money and property while warehousing me in a nursing home. But a different kind of future, where love came with wisdom, where trust was earned instead of assumed, and where the people we'd all become could build something real together. It wasn't the family story I dreamed of when I first held each of my babies. But it was honest, and it was sustainable, and it was built on the solid foundation of truth instead of the quicksand of manipulation and denial. Sometimes, I realized as the first stars appeared over the Montana mountains, you have to lose your family to save it. Sometimes protecting yourself is the only way to protect the relationship. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very strong, everyone learns something valuable from the wreckage of what used to be, and you get to build something better from the pieces that remain. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and the promise of snow. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, and somewhere down the mountain, my daughter was driving home to a life she'd rebuilt with her own hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And after everything we'd been through, real was enough to build on.